Next slide. So Wilder mentioned this, the chemical reaction, and it's basically you're burning glucose in oxygen. So you're using oxygen to burn glucose. Okay. All right. Now, these are just a quick general overview of the processes in cellular respiration. So the very first process is called glycolysis. Right here, glycolysis. Now, in this step, interestingly, you do not need oxygen. Remember, we come back here to look at the chemical reactions, the oxygen is required, but it's really required later, but not in the initial glycolysis process. So we can say glycolysis is anaerobic, right? Aerobic, that means oxygen is involved. Anaerobic means you don't need oxygen. And then this is the location where glycolysis takes place. So it takes place in cytoplasm, actually not inside the mitochondria. Okay, we all know that mitochondria is the powerhouse because it produces ATP, and it produces ATP because it can burn glucose and then capture that energy and put that energy in ATP. But the first step of cellular respiration, glycolysis, actually happens outside mitochondria in the cytoplasm. At the end of glycolysis, glucose is converted to, you have to know this, pyruvate. Okay. And then glucose has 6 carbons, pyruvate has 3 carbons. So that means one glucose can produce 2 molecules of pyruvate. Okay. Now in glycolysis, a very small amount of energy is generated. So you gain 2 ATP molecules. This is important for cells that do not have a mitochondria. So for example, our red blood cells, I think we mentioned this before, our red blood cells are packed with hemoglobin, so they don't really have mitochondria. They just don't have that extra space to carry some other cell organelles. So they don't have mitochondria, so they can only perform glycolysis. Now, the bad thing about that is it only provides a very small amount of energy. Okay. All right, and then depending on whether oxygen is available, so it depends on whether oxygen is available, you may go down these two or one of these two possible routes. Okay, so the first one is cellular respiration. So it requires energy, aerobic, and that happens in mitochondria. We're going to talk about each pathway in this direction. So if you have energy and you go through this entire pathway, you are going to generate a lot of energy. Okay, so you're going to have a lot of ATP produced at the end. And then there are 3 steps. I like to kind of treat the pyruvate oxidation as a separate step. So we have pyruvate oxidation, number 1, citric acid cycle, and then electron transport. Okay. Now, for some organisms, for example, yeasts, okay, or some bacteria, they can get energy without oxygen. Okay, so when no oxygen is available, then they can metabolize by doing this fermentation. So this is anaerobic, there's no oxygen involved. So instead of converting pyruvate to carbon dioxide and then water, you are converting pyruvate to lactic acid or ethanol. Okay. You probably realize that this is actually very important, right? It has really important implications for our real life because this is how you make alcohol, right? Ethanol is the main the active ingredient in alcohol. So we have really kind of mastered the process. So we're using microbes to ferment to make ethanol, to make alcohol. Even though you don't need oxygen, which you may think as an advantage, the con is that you don't make too much energy compared to when you have oxygen and do complete combustion of glucose. Because in this process, you have lactic acid or ethanol, and so that means the glucose is not completely broken down. So you don't release all the energy. So you make much less energy. Okay, so let's look at the first step, glycolysis. We mentioned some of the characteristics of this step. So here is some figures showing you the pathways. Now, I don't need you to memorize the product for every single step. So what I would do is I need you to be able to correctly read and understand figures. And then I will give you figures on the test with all the details. So you really just need to read the figures and then use the information available to answer questions. Okay, so let's see the first picture. So you have a glucose, which is 6 hard carbon right here. And then you are going to use ATP. So you're going to consume energy first. Okay, I'm just going to put consume. So you're going to consume ATP first. And then you're going to break down ATP to ADP and the phosphate groups, right? And then you're going to attach these phosphate groups to this 6-carbon glucose. And that's going to generate 6-carbon sugar, which is a it's a sugar with a 2-phosphate. And then the next step, this molecule is going to break down to 2 molecules. They're identical. Okay? So that's a 3-carbon sugar with a 1-phosphate, right? You divide 6 carbon to 2, that's a 3. And then 2-phosphate split between 2 molecules, that's going to be 1-phosphate. All right? Okay, now next step. So you can see over here, this is the end of the arrow, right? The end of the arrow right here is pointing to NADH, also points to ADP. That means that these molecules are produced in the chemical reaction. So in this process, when you convert this carbon sugar with a phosphate attached to pyruvate, you are generating NADH, which is an electron carrier. Remember? Because the previous form is NAD+, but when it receives electron and hydrogen, it becomes NADH. So right now it's carrying electron or hydrogen atom. Okay, so you have 2 NADH molecules produced. And then over here, so again, the arrow is pointing to ATP, so that means this process produces 2 ATP molecules. And then together, 2 plus 2, that's 4. So in the end, you get 2 NADH and 4 ATP. All right, now let's look at end or net change. So for 1 glucose, you produce 2 pyruvate, because again, pyruvate has 3 carbons, and then glucose has 6 carbons. Okay, so it has to be 2 pyruvate molecules. And then you have 2 NADH, okay, which I pointed before, the 2 NADH. And then the net change for ATP. Remember, you have to invest or consume 2 ATP molecules at the beginning, and then in the end, you generate 4. So that means the net change is 2, right? You consume 2, and then you produce 4. So the net change is you gain 2 ATP molecules. So that's what this part is about, net change, gain 2 ATP. Okay, so again, you don't have to really memorize the number. Just know that it's a small amount of energy because it's only 2 ATP, right? It's not that much energy. And then the second thing is, if I give you this picture, can you tell me what goes into the pathway, what comes out of the pathway? Okay. All right, now there's an interesting fact. We kind of mentioned this earlier. So some cells cannot catabolize the pyruvate molecules further. So what they do is they can only produce 2 ATP molecules from glycolysis process. Okay? From how many molecules of glucose? 1 molecule. Okay. So for example, mammalian red blood cells. Okay? So they don't have mitochondria. They can't really go further down the pathway, so they stop at the end of glycolysis. Okay, the next process is pyruvate oxidation. So this is the link between glycolysis and the next step, which is called the citric acid cycle. So in this process, pyruvate, which is produced in the cytoplasm, is transported to mitochondria. Okay? So let's look at the structure of mitochondria. Mitochondria is kind of interesting because it's got 2 membranes. So it's got 2 membranes. If you remember from the cellular structure chapter, some of the cell organelles, they are single membrane bound organelle. So for example, lysosome, remember there's only one membrane, right? So mitochondria actually have two membranes. So the outer one is called outer membrane, and the inside, which is here, that's inner membrane. So if I draw it here, this is the outer membrane, and then the inner membrane form folds. So there you go. So that's the inner membrane, right? There you go. Okay, so outer, and then this is inner. Okay, and then the next term is in between the two membranes, you will see some intermembrane space. Okay, so we're going to use that term later. And then the space inside the inner membrane, that's called a matrix. So again, we're going to use this component too. All right, now you can see inside the matrix, you will see some ATP synthase particles. So you're going to have some protein enzymes, which can produce ATP, can synthesize ATP. So we call them ATP synthase. All right, now that's pretty much it for the structure of mitochondria. Okay, now let's look at pyruvate oxidation. So we mentioned that the pyruvate will be transported from the cytoplasm into mitochondria. Okay, and what's going to happen next? It's going to be oxidized. So if it's oxidized, that means it loses electrons and hydrogen atom, right? So it's oxidized. So it's going to be oxidized to a 2-carbon molecule, which is called acetate. Okay? And then the acetate is going to bound to an enzyme, which is called a coenzyme A. Coenzyme A. It's actually not an enzyme, but it's involved in the enzymatic reactions. Okay, so it's called a coenzyme. So the end result is you are going to form acetyl coenzyme A, and most of the times we just write it as acetyl-CoA. Okay, acetyl-CoA. All right, now acetyl-CoA. Since you know that it's involved in cellular respiration, you probably know that it's super important for normal cellular functions. So the coenzyme A actually originates from vitamin B5. Okay. So that's why you need all the nutrients, including some of the vitamins. And for coenzyme A, you need a B5 to be able to make a coenzyme A. Okay, now what's the end result from this picture? Okay, so this is what you put in, that's the reactant, and what do you get? First thing, you get carbon dioxide. So that's a part of the carbon dioxide that you breathe out not every second, but close. Okay. And then what else is produced? So you have NAD, starting as the reactant, and then in the end you have NADH. So that's the other product produced at the end of this chemical reaction. Okay. All right, and then the third is this acetyl-CoA. Okay, so that's the three things coming out of the pyruvate oxidation pathway. Here, end products for 1 glucose, you are going to get 2 acetyl-CoA. And why is that? Because 1 glucose is broken down to 2 pyruvate, right? So pyruvate, and then this is the same, the second pyruvate. And each pyruvate right here will be converted to 1 acetyl-CoA. So that means with 2 pyruvates, you're going to have 2 acetyl-CoA. And then the same thing here, right? Each pyruvate is going to generate 1 NADH. So from 2 pyruvates, that's 2 NADH. Okay? And then again, same thing for carbon dioxide, 2 carbon dioxide. All right. So another interesting fact, this is about acetyl-CoA. So acetyl-CoA, normally they would go down to the next step of cellular respiration, which is citric acid, right? To be oxidized more to release energy. But if your body has a lot of ATP, the level is really high, which means your body really don't need more ATP as the immediate battery or fuel source. Then acetyl-CoA can be channeled into fatty acid synthesis, which means your body, instead of making ATP, your body is going to make fatty acids. Basically, it makes fat. So this is why you gain weight, you gain fat when you eat a lot of food, because that excess food will be channeled into fatty acid synthesis. All right. Okay, next step, citric acid cycle. This is also called the Krebs cycle. So if you see Krebs cycle, they're really the same thing. So again, this picture is quite complicated. Again, you don't need to memorize all the products generated in the pathway. So really, you just need to know a couple things. Okay. So first of all, acetyl-CoA, which is over here. This is what you kind of start with, right? So you provide acetyl-CoA from pyruvate oxidation, and acetyl-CoA is going to be incorporated in this kind of cyclic pathway. Okay, so you can see it forms a circle, right? So you start from here, and then you add over here. First, you're gonna here the two red carbons enter the cycle via acetyl-CoA. So these two comes from acetyl-CoA, and then you are going to make this compound called citric, and this is mostly why we call this cycle the citric acid cycle. Okay, all right. The second thing, you just need to know the end product. So again, you don't have to memorize this. I'm going to give you a picture like this. You just need to figure out how to read the figure and identify what products are made during this citric acid cycle. So I highlighted the things. So you can see the arrows pointing to carbon dioxide and the NADH, right? So this citric acid cycle is going to produce those molecules. So let's see how many molecules of each we make. Okay, so you have one carbon dioxide, 2. So that's 2, right? Okay, so how come I have a 4 carbon dioxide over here? If you remember, 1 glucose produces 2 pyruvate, right? And then each pyruvate is turned into acetyl-CoA. So that means 1 glucose is going to generate 2 acetyl-CoA. So you double just 2 carbon dioxide, and then you're going to do it twice because 2 acetyl-CoA. So that's a total of 4 carbon dioxide from 1 glucose. And then let's look at NADH. 1, 2, 3. All right, so 3, again, you double it, that's going to be 6. It's going to generate a second type of electron carrier, that's the FADH2. So let's see, there's only 1 FADH2 over here, and you double that, that's 2. This process also makes ATP. So you have ATP, so it could be GTP or ATP. So we're going to use ATP here. So again, 1 ATP is produced, and then you double that, so that's 2 ATP. Okay. So remember the main things generated in the citric acid cycle. So you have energy carrying molecules, ATP. You have electron carriers, NADH and FADH2, and you also generate some waste in the form of carbon dioxide. So remember, in the pyruvate oxidation, we generate 2 carbon dioxide, right? And now we generate 4 carbon dioxide. So collectively, that's 6 carbon dioxide molecules generated from the glucose oxidation, cellular respiration pathway. Okay, so now you get all the carbon dioxide out of the way. All right, now the very last step is called the electron transport chain. Now this process produces most of the ATP made by cellular respiration. So what happens in the electron transport chain? ATP synthesis, resulting from the oxidation of electron carriers in the presence of oxygen. So remember in the previous step, and also in pyruvate oxidation, we generate some electron carriers, right? The NADH and FADH2. So now those electron carriers will be oxidized, and they're going to give away, they're going to lose the electrons that they carry. And that energy will be used to synthesize ATP. So that's why most of the ATP molecules are actually made in this process, in this last step. That process requires energy. It requires oxygen. So I'll talk about why oxygen has to be required, has to be present. So this process is called oxidative. That means you are oxidizing those electron carriers. Phosphorylation, again, you are making ATP from ADP, right? Okay, there you go. Now, remember, you are going to add a phosphate to ADP. So you're adding phosphate group, that's called phosphorylation. So together, that process is called oxidative phosphorylation. So this process takes place in the inner part of the cell membrane if it's unicellular organism. More specifically, prokaryote. So if it's a bacteria cell, it happens in the cell membrane, and if it's eukaryote, it's going to happen in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Remember, there are two membranes, outer membrane, inner membrane. So this process is going to happen in the more interior part, which is the inner membrane. Okay, so that's a very kind of dynamic process. So I provided a link to a video here. The video is actually made really well. So you can watch that video to kind of help you understand the process. Okay, so it's really kind of like the pass of electrons, and then you're using that energy to move hydrogen ion and eventually make ATP. Okay, so I'm gonna leave that to you, so make sure you watch that video, okay? And I'll provide some questions for you to kind of practice. You have to watch that video first, and then you can answer these questions. So why do we require oxygen to survive? And why cyanide is a poison? Okay. Now, what if we don't have oxygen? Remember the second pathway, that's fermentation, right? So we are going to just use a different strategy to extract energy from glucose. So the pro is that you don't need oxygen. The con is that you don't generate as much energy as if oxygen was available. Okay, so there are two types of fermentation. You can have a lactate fermentation, which generates lactic acid. Lactic acid. Now, this can happen in our body, actually. It can happen to muscle cells. So let's say you haven't really worked out for years, and then you get on a very strenuous hike, and so your muscle cells have to work very hard, and it's kind of hard to meet the oxygen demands of those muscle cells. So in that case, when oxygen is not available, those muscle cells, because they have to contract so hard, right? They're going to resort to the less They're going to have to resort to the less optimal route to produce energy. Okay, sorry, I don't know why I just had hard time remembering optimal, the word. So they're going to use lactate fermentation. So they can make a small amount of energy, but then in the end, lactic acid is produced. So that may give you, some of the discomfort in your muscles, like muscle cramps, fatigue. Okay. The second type of fermentation is called alcoholic fermentation. You can just say alcohol fermentation. So in this route, you are going to produce carbon dioxide and ethanol. I don't know if you noticed that in the lactic acid fermentation, you generate lactic acid, right? So it's an acid, but you don't have any gas produced. So no gas product. Okay, which is good, because otherwise you're going to have a lot of probably gas bubbles in your skeletal muscles when you climb or when you work out. That's not going to be good. But in ethanol fermentation or alcoholic fermentation, in addition to ethanol, this process also generates carbon dioxide. And this is a kind of good thing.